because Europe at one point wanted to impose fuel standard rows that would have kept tar sands out of the European market, and that's been a huge contretemps between the Canadians in particular, but also the Americans and the EU. And so far, they have been, the European governments have been bending to that pressure from America. Now, one of the reasons they've been bending is because we've looked at what's happened on fracking and said, wow, all that cheap stuff, we want to get our hands on it here, because otherwise, and quite a lot of this is specious, otherwise it puts our businesses at a competitive disadvantage. Well, not too sure about that. But so the reason it's become an issue in the way you describe is because we want the Americans to allow the export of fracked oil, and the North Americans want us to allow carbon-heavy tar sands and oil sands fuels into Europe. And that's exactly the kind of bargain that, in a way, brings trade rules into disrepute, because it's a straightforward political bargain. It's very hard to justify that there's a lot of benefit in that, really, for people, particularly if you then take on the consequences of that for the climate. And so the climate argument now says, well, hang on, why are we trying to make all this easier when we're trying to really slow down the use of these things? What is the point of making it easier through the trade rules for this sort of trade to take place? And I must say, governments have not come up with a very good answer on either side of the Atlantic to that question. So, and we're not going to do any fracking here, by the way, just the other side of that. And the idea that we will be fracking for gas or oil anytime this decade is pretty unrealistic. Works in the headlines, though.
Last couple of questions.
Thank you very much. James Hughes, I work independently. The European Commission, I understand, has decided that burning wood in large power stations is carbon neutral and there's no carbon debt. And Drax, the big power station in the UK, is buying a very large amount of wood pellets from the USA. Drax is owned by a US company, an investment manager, and most of the pellets are supplied by the same sorts of people. I would imagine this would be one of the first TTIP cases when, and I hope that it does very soon, the UK and the EU say that we shouldn't be burning wood in big power stations.
I mean, biomass is difficult, and it was a sort of, we got ourselves into a sort of bad position on policy 20 years ago by thinking that biomass was a good idea and not thinking it through. I don't think it's a particularly attractive idea to import wood for power stations, but I think we should be moving as fast as we possibly can away from large power stations anyway into much more distributed generation. So I'm not sure that that particular problem has a long life. I'm much more concerned about the massive amount of support and the requirements to include biomass in transport fuels, which I think is a more serious consequences for the environment than the wood chip industry. So if I'm scaling the sort of problems, the particular one, I don't see a big scope for growth in biomass for electricity generation. I don't think it should be happening, but it's not the issue I put first. I would want us to get out of the idea that you're producing ethanol to put in a transport fuel, and you're turning large areas of land over to production of those fuels, which I think is really much more worrying. In that case too, I think we should be moving far faster and investing in moving far faster to electric vehicles. My own sense of where we're going with battery storage and with renewable electricity is we're not that far away from the point at which that's going to make an awful lot of sense. I just read the other day that the Chinese city of Shenzhen, that's the big bit near Hong Kong, has just decided to spend £800 million over the next 5 years, $800 million over the next 5 years in promoting electric vehicles in China. And if the Chinese do to electric vehicles what they did to solar panels, we'll soon be driving, within 10 to 15 years, we'll all be driving around in electric vehicles. So again, really much more important, in my view, to focus on what you want to do rather than on stopping what you shouldn't do. I certainly don't want to make it easier through the trade rules to do the things we shouldn't be doing.
Kate Hodgson, Haldane Society for Socialist Lawyers. Thank you very much. Hugely helpful presentation. This morning we heard about CETA, and my question is, are we too late about CETA? And someone, that's the Canadian sort of equivalent.
Oh, yeah, sorry, yes.
Maybe I'm pronouncing it wrongly because
No,
I only
you
heard
are.
about it today. And a brilliant suggestion from the floor that what about a challenge through the Aarhus Convention, and I just wondered whether you had any ideas about that.
I don't. I haven't followed that piece. I've been following this specifically because it's something I know about, the regulatory coherence piece. I haven't been following the wider issue enough to add anything to what you heard this morning. Should we use every means we can on every issue to create transparency? Yes, and we should make more use of Aarhus. I think we've neglected a bit in this country on a number of issues.
Coincidentally, Tom, the lady who raised the Aarhus question before had the microphone. Emily, did you want to come back on that? Ask the question.
No, please. I mean,
again,
talk to the person who knows something about it.
Raised.
Sorry, what did you want to ask about the Aarhus Convention specifically? I mean,
the point you made earlier.
Tom's experience, whether he had any view,
whether
that would be
I've not been involved.
CETA, whether we're too late. Have we missed the boat with CETA?
Well, I would have thought, unless the government, because there's an election coming up in Canada quite shortly as well, if Harper stays in, then we're probably stuffed. But if somebody else gets in, but there doesn't seem to be a particular person at the moment who's really going to get in, then we may have a chance of unseating it. But in Canada, it's very bad news for the environment at the moment. In terms of Aarhus, the thing that I brought up earlier about it was that there's a provision in the Aarhus Convention for public participation in environmental decision making, and that's from the beginning of the process right to the end of the process. And clearly, what I've heard, and I know very little about TTIP until today, is it appears that there's been very little public participation from the very outset. So I would have thought it's something worth investigating, but that's all I can say.
Yeah. And the Canadians, obviously, the big drivers of that bargain about access, about US oil being exportable and Canadian tar sands oil being importable into Europe. That's the bargain that the trade people are trying to strike. So I guess that question is quite important, but I don't know much about where we are in the process.
Professor Nicholas de Sailly.
Yes, I was interested in your comments regarding the difference as a matter of political cultures on both sides of the Atlantics. And given that I had the chance 10 years ago to take part in the unofficial rounds of consumer side of the transatlantic negotiations, I really agree with your comments. I imagine there is a bigger chance to quash federal regulations before federal US courts than before EU and national constitutional courts. I looked at the figures still a few years ago, and in the US lawyers litigating, requesting the review of President order have a 50% chance to obtain the nullification. Whereas the figure before the General Court and the Court of Justice of the European Union is somewhat 10% of success in quashing. And that means often that's just one paragraph. At national level, you got even with some jurisdictions, lower figures can amount to up to 5% of success. So whereas US lawyers are extremely successful in litigating against the regional and the state and federal governments, European public lawyers are far less successful. So that can also be added as part of the difference in.
You're quite right about that, and it's one of the things that I see as a major obstacle to getting any real level of regulatory cooperation on environmental matters, because access to the courts, as you're saying, in Europe is very limited. the system is set up in a way in which to reduce the scope of the courts by creating a very broadly based political consensus and a very deep understanding of exactly what the law means. That's what the system is set up to produce. So it limits the scope for the courts, so it doesn't matter that you don't have access to it. The idea that American companies or American NGOs would accept European standards of access to the courts is very optimistic. They're used to going to the courts and having a lot of access to the courts, and the courts having a lot of scope to interpret the legislation. Now, the underlying basis of that is, in some sense, Europe is a law-making culture and America is a rule-making culture. And that creates very different sets of expectations. And in a way, the courts follow the expectations and the access to the court. So getting standing before the European court is very difficult. It's very easy to get standing before the American courts. And I don't know how you overcome that obstacle to actually making the environmental laws work better together across the Atlantic. And it certainly, to my mind, is one of the safeguards, because the idea that you would get the kind of American standards of litigation against people trying to impose higher standards, the whole argument of takings, which is very important and keeps coming up in America, has no resonance at all in Europe. And so there are major culture clashes locked up inside this piece, which have not yet really been explored.
One very last quick question at the back.
Yes, hello, it's Emily Shirley again. I just wanted to ask a question about fracking. You said earlier that we would not be seeing fracking here in any shape or form in the next 10 years, and I just wanted to know why you say that.
Because we don't have, well, for lots of reasons. One, although this is very recent, is because the price of oil has fallen by 50%. Two, because the geology is completely different than it is in the United States. And even if you were to have the kind of industrial infrastructure in place to do it, the costs will be a lot higher than they are in the United States. And finally, there is going to be massive public opposition to industrializing the countryside, which is what it takes. And it's one thing to talk about objecting to a single drilling site, and you can do that reasonably well, and cleaning it up after you've done your test drill. It's another thing to come up with an investable proposition, which might mean you're building a series of these pads all over the countryside, connecting them up, running them 24/7. And I just don't think the public acceptability will be there. So combine the lack of any public acceptability, likelihood of public acceptability, plus the additional cost. And the government got what it really wanted out of it, which was good headlines. And that's about all I think it's going to get out of it. Now, will there be some odd places where there might be a bit of fracking? Yeah. But mainly the government's preoccupation with it was to get a headline that showed everybody that it was getting people to invest in the economy and it was making the economy work. Which, it was pretty clear. It's been very straightforward about what it was trying to make the election an issue about. And fracking was, I think, mainly about standing up that headline. We're making the country worthwhile investing in. I don't think it's got anything to do with it. And I don't know anybody in the serious players in the oil and gas industry who think that the government's obsession with fracking did anything more than slow the process down. Which is, again, the law of unintended consequences, which we've come up with.
Can I just, with regret, draw this session to a conclusion, because it's been a superb presentation ranging over a range of issues. Are you staying around for a few minutes?
I can't, I'm afraid. I have another meeting this afternoon.
Okay. Well, thanks very much.
No, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
Indeed to Tom Burke for his presentation. Good, right. Okay, sorry about that. I wasn't quite sure how we were doing on the slides front. final session before tea is an area which I think is perhaps a particular concern. We've seen how trade has environmental consequences. Perhaps the best example where trade is the environmental problem is the damage which is done to endangered species of flora and fauna. I'm talking about CITES. We have an expert commentator, and I can say this because I listened to you speak last year, yes? Shruti Suresh is the Environmental Investigation Agency, has a wide experience of this matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to thank PIEL for giving us an opportunity to speak at this conference today. I'm Shruti Suresh. I'm a lawyer and a wildlife campaigner at the Environmental Investigation Agency, where I work on wildlife crime issues. Today I'd like to discuss with you the issue of illegal trade in wildlife and how these issues are addressed under the UN Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, or CITES, and how EIA believes that illegal trade to satisfy demand or satisfy consumption is not really a viable option when it comes to certain wildlife species if we are to ensure their survival in the wild. Before I get into the details, I'd like to briefly introduce EIA for those who don't know us or not familiar with the work we do. EIA is an international non-governmental organization based in London, and we also have an office in the US. How we work is we investigate and expose environmental crime and are committed to advocating for an effective criminal justice response to tackle such crime. We gather information and data from a variety of sources, primarily from field investigations in Africa and Asia, as well as from reliable historical and contemporary sources and desk-based research. We then gather this information, analyze it, and release it as public reports, which is used to inform decision-making at the national and international level. On some occasions, we also provide confidential briefings with nominal information on suspected criminals, which is then shared on a limited basis with enforcement authorities at the national level, as well as with intergovernmental organizations like Interpol and the World Customs Organization. We've been documenting the illegal trade in wildlife for over 3 decades now, and the findings of our investigations have clearly demonstrated the role of organized, serious criminal syndicates in the landscape of illegal trade in wildlife. Our investigations also show that when it comes to a parallel legal trade in wildlife species such as elephant ivory and tiger skins, such a legal trade has failed to curb an illegal trade in the wild specimens of these species, and has in fact stimulated further demand for wildlife products derived from these species. The trade in wildlife is not a new phenomenon. This picture, for example, is a picture of a seizure of more than 30 skins and nearly 600 leopard skins and a whole load of other wildlife specimens in a single seizure incident in Tibet in 2003. The trade is massive, and there's no doubt about that. What is increasingly clear now is the role of transnational organized crime in this trade. Illegal trade in wildlife is now considered to be the 4th largest transnational organized criminal activity after drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and human trafficking. And as I said, it's worth billions of dollars, which makes it more attractive for criminals. The techniques, the methods used for trade in wildlife is similar to techniques and methods used for trade in other contraband. The proceeds of illegal wildlife trade are used to fuel further criminal activities, and it is becoming increasingly clear that criminals are operating in this landscape by exploiting gaps and loopholes in national law enforcement and criminal justice systems. While the impact of trade in wildlife is very obviously on the wildlife species involved, the impact goes much beyond that. It's not just about biodiversity laws, but it's also about how the illegal trade in wildlife subverts the rule of law, how it's closely connected with money laundering and corruption, and how it undermines national economies and deprives local communities of their livelihoods and the incomes that are dependent upon the wildlife that they live close to. The key instrument that addresses the issue of illegal wildlife trade is the UN Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species in Flora and Fauna, or CITES. Now, this is a conservation agreement with a very large membership. Currently has 180 countries that have ratified this convention. It protects and regulates trade in more than 35,000 plant and animal species. These species are listed in 3 appendices, 1, 2, and 3. The species listed in Appendix 1 are considered to be very severely threatened by trade, and all commercial trade in species listed in CITES Appendix 1 are strictly prohibited, subject to very special exceptional circumstances such as trade in antiques, which is allowed even for Appendix 1 species. For species listed in Appendix 2 and Appendix 3, commercial trade is not prohibited. It's merely regulated, and trade is allowed subject to CITES permitting processes. Now, I've attended several CITES meetings over the years, and one thing I can tell you is the issue of listing of a species, where the species falls in one of these 3 appendices, is a hugely controversial issue, especially when it comes to megafauna like African elephants. So just to give you an idea of the kind of species we're talking about here, and I thought it would be nice to have some pictures here, given that we're sort of nearing the end of the day. With tigers, obviously this is a species that is heavily decimated by trade. The population has now fallen to as low as 3,200 individuals in the wild, and we have this low population because of illegal trade for poaching. The species is listed in CITES Appendix 1. And because of the highly endangered status of tigers in the wild, CITES parties have also decided to prohibit all trade in tiger parts, be it derived from wild source or a captive source. Now, just to take a step back, how CITES works is because it's an international treaty, its jurisdiction is supposed to be limited only to international trade and international trade in wild specimens. So it is quite a exceptional circumstance, really, to have the parties to CITES call on all other parties to prohibit domestic trade, not just in wild specimens, but also in captive specimens. And this has been done in the exceptional case of tigers because of their endangered status. Almost every body part of a tiger is valued for trade. You have skins being used for luxury rugs used for home decor. Tiger bone is used to brew tiger bone wine, which is considered to be bone strengthening wine. Now, initially, it was considered to be medicine use for traditional use, but what we're now seeing in China and Vietnam and Laos and other Asian countries is that this use is no longer connected with traditional medicine. It's no longer about tradition or culture. This is now being associated with a symbol of high status and as luxury use. It really doesn't have much to do anymore with culture. With elephants, African elephants are listed under, in a very controversial issue, under both appendices. It's been split listed under both Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. And as we all know, Africa is currently facing a very serious elephant poaching crisis. In merely 3 years, between 2000 and 2012, Africa lost at least 100,000 elephants due to trade for ivory. Ivory is mainly used for carving elaborate statuettes such as this one, and it's also really rockets, and we're just saying do exactly what you do with other organized criminal activities, but don't just treat this as a fluffy green offense, which is what is a problem especially in African countries and developing countries in Asia as well. When you look at court records and everything, it may be a really serious poaching incident or a trafficking incident, but a judge doesn't really see it as that because it's still treated as a very fluffy offense. So that's what we're trying to address.
Final question at the back there.
Hi, I'm Aline. I'm a student at UCL. My understanding is that there's no international sort of uniform sanction to be placed on this organized crime, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on how that could, if there's any scope that that's going to change, because then we've got different countries enforcing it in different ways. If you have this discrepancy in the punishment, I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, you have sanctions at the national level for illegal trade in wildlife, and we've been looking at wildlife laws in several countries in Africa and Asia, and you're right, there is a huge discrepancy. Within the EU itself, you have member states whose wildlife laws have the maximum penalty of less than 2 years for illegal trade in wildlife, whereas the UN Convention on Organized Crime requires a minimum of at least 4 years imprisonment for it to be treated as a serious organized crime. So you're right, there is a serious issue of harmonization of wildlife laws, not just in Asia and Africa, but back home here within the EU as well. But in terms of sanctions at the international level, the benefit of CITES is that unlike other international conventions, it actually has teeth. It could slap a party with trade sanctions. And we have seen that happen most recently in the context of Nigeria and Cameroon and Laos, where the countries have been slapped with trade sanctions. And all trade in CITES species has been suspended till they can demonstrate compliance. So this can provide a very, very important hook to extract compliance from parties with CITES. And it has to be used more frequently than it is currently being used.
Okay. Thanks very much indeed for a very interesting presentation, Shruti. We're taking a short tea break, and the final parts of the conference are on forestry and waste management. So see you again shortly.
If I could see you all back here at 10 past, the break's been extended by 5 minutes.
Right.
Thank you.
So they don't see Fancy. I know, it's really confusing. There we go. Ready? Cool. So yeah, edit it as you want. We're using, and then save it afterwards.
Yeah, don't worry.
Well, I would think so, but you have to put yourself in the perspective of others. Sorry about my blank look to do with slides, but it's not my department. But hopefully you'll get some assistance from someone.
I've got assistance.
Right, good. Well, I look forward to the presentation. I don't know whether we've crossed paths before. I'm Bill Howarth, and you're
Margaret Bates.
Margaret Bates, Waste Management Law. So the
Most toxic place to human health on Earth.
Is that right?
Yes. Beats Chernobyl in second place.
Right, so that's not much of a recommendation.
It's very interesting.
We have three speakers and an hour's session. So I'm thinking it would be about 15 minutes.
Yep, that's cool.
For the presentation. So I hope that doesn't mean too much.
No, it's all right. I've already made my decisions.
Right, good.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I'm struggling with save now. Yeah. But I think
I don't know if I can. Oh.
Yeah, but see, if you get it wrong, that's fine. I don't mind. If I get it wrong, I do. No, well, maybe. Yeah.
I'm just going to do it this like this. Control S.
So
That should be
think
okay.
that.
I'm not going to close it, so that's just what's going to come up. So it's going to stay there. So even if it didn't save, it's still okay. You've just deleted some.
Yeah, that's all.
Okay.
But I'm not until the session.
That's
not
fine.
next
I'll just keep it.
session
I'll just
afterwards.
keep it underneath here
Oh, cool.
somewhere. That should be fine. Okay. Thank you.
Just leave. Could you possibly help me with logging on for this? You're in the next session. Exactly. So I look forward to your presentation. We've got 3 speakers.
Yes, and we have a slide chain because I think you might
Let me just see if the document between panel members.
You're both pointer people.
So this is just a USB which has all our yeah, this goes. No.
Those things do happen. It's a very interesting discussion. It's really quite tricky to keep everything going. No, that would be great. I'm thinking we've got an hour session with 3 presenters. All the questions, so maybe quarter of an hour. Yeah, each of us. And I don't know. You've been called in meeting or there's a very
Yeah, it is good because we do more investigative work than
I don't know, I've got slides. Well, there's some wonderful people who are doing great things. I don't know anything about. Thanks very much, Jocelyn, for sorting this out.
unless